Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just going to give people another couple minutes to sign in, and then we'll get started. Well, all right, let's get started. If people still want to trickle in, that's completely fine. So, hello, everyone. My name is Bob Cortland. I am a senior solutions engineer with Questica, and today we're going to be exploring how to predict both enrollment and revenue in higher education. Of course, this is a very topical discussion as especially in the last few years, we've seen a lot of volatility in the revenue streams, traditional revenue streams at least, of a lot of our colleges and universities across the world. So let's dive into ways that we can start to more accurately predict what the future can hold for us. If there are any questions as we're moving along, please feel free to use that chat function, and we'll keep an eye on that to address any questions or comments as we move around. I know this has been budgeted to be about an hour long. My intention is to be done much sooner than that, probably around the 40 or 45-minute mark. So with that, let's get into our agenda for today. We're going to talk about why we're here in the first place, and we're going to talk about the challenges and some of the difficulties that come with forecasting for our colleges and universities. So to help forecasting, it's usually best to adopt a model of some kind. And these models can be very helpful in their explanatory power, and they can also be very powerful in terms of meaningful predictions to the future. So we're going to explore a few different options in terms of models. Certainly not an exhaustive list, and we're not going to be doing a super deep dive in any specific areas, just giving you a sense of what some of the options are that are out there. Then we'll talk about some of the options you have if you're looking to convert a model to actual practice at your institution. We'll talk about some technology considerations as well as a very quick demonstration of a proof of concept of one of these models in action. And if there is, there will be some time at the end as well for open discussion and questions and answers. So feel free to save some questions for the end, or feel free to use that chat function as we move along. So with that out of the way, let's jump right in. Why are we here today? Hopefully we can give you some background in terms of some of the history, some of the concepts and strategies that higher education institutions are currently using and have used in the past to both forecast enrollment and revenues associated with those enrollment figures. We're going to introduce you to some of these concepts and models and approaches, as well as give you those real-world applications. Hopefully this all gives you some ideas internally for how to improve processes which either maybe don't exist or don't exist on a very sophisticated level, to gather ideas about how this could potentially help your institution. So when we look at the history of higher education, the very first university, or what we would call a higher education institution, was the University of Bologna back in 1088. And so we've had higher education, at least as a specific concept, for about 900 plus years at this point. And we've certainly seen a lot of evolution in this space since that original university was founded, and still actually exists to this day in Italy. So universities and colleges can have different shapes, different forms. We see a concept of public, we have private nonprofit institutions. We also have private for-profit institutions. So each one of these is going to be substantially different in their approaches to enrollment, to revenues, to subsidies from things like government entities. And they all have their own set of financial challenges. What affects one public institution could be an incredibly different set of financial challenges than a private institution. The public institution may suffer from, government cutbacks, whereas the private for-profit institution could suffer from things like competition in the marketplace. So unique challenges, but challenges nonetheless will apply to all of these different types of institutions, and really highlights the hardships of planning in these dynamic environments. We have all of these factors that could potentially affect both enrollment rates as well as tuition revenue streams. And these things are changing all the time and subject to things like legislative changes, as well as the behaviors and the appetites of potential students. So makes it very difficult to plan given how dynamic this kind of financial environment is for all of these different types of higher educational institutions. When we look specifically at enrollment forecasting, there's a lot of complexity that can come with forecasting what future student counts will look like. Each institution is going to be drastically different in terms of how they categorize and classify their different types of students, as well as what these classifications mean in terms of ultimately the revenue that you collect from them. So is a student going to be enrolling full-time versus part-time? Are they taking a partial credit course or an audit type course? Are there capacities to certain programs? There's an upper limit in many cases to programs that's going to affect which students can even get in the first place. There might be different sized cohorts, and that could be related to just demographic data. You might have a surge of applicants one year versus a reduction in another, and this can wildly change, your forecast and the revenue streams that are going to come to your institution as a result. Attrition rates as well can be variable, and this can also be variable within the same school. You may have a very high dropout rate in one particular program, but a very high continuation rate in another. And this variability, again, adds another layer and dimension of sophistication when we're trying to forecast, how many students to expect in any given area of the school. That next bullet, these historical trends sometimes don't tell the full picture. What has happened in the past isn't necessarily what's going to take place in the future. So again, these dimensions can all layer complexity as well as throw things you may not have expected into future years. So there's a ton of things to consider that could affect both historical data as well as impact future student enrollment. These could be things like grants, scholarships, programs, visibility. All of these types of things can make forecasting difficult because it's tough to factor all of these different individual components into an entire complete picture. And when we start to look at the revenue side of things, once we have the student side, then it's a matter of calculating the revenues that can be calculated as a result. But every institution is also going to be different in terms of how they cost out their education. So, tuition rates are one thing, but we can also have things like student fees. We can have potentially other types of costs related to specific programs, like a lab cost for a science program, for example. And then we also have different rates depending on the type of student that's going to be attending. Is it an international student? Is it a domestic student, or an in-state versus out-of-state student? These structures can vary wildly, even within the same organization. Two students that go to the same school may be paying entirely different set of rates and fees depending on the program they're enrolled in, or what year of the program they might enroll in. Is it an undergraduate program versus a graduate, for example? And there are lots of other miscellaneous costs that also have to be factored in. And each time you layer in another dimension, it's going to make it more and more difficult to get a clear picture of the revenue side of the fence. So how do we handle all of this? Well, one method we can do is to adopt a model that's going to help us kind of understand the data, and there is usually a large, overwhelming amount of data that a school has to factor in if they're going to effectively have a solution or a technique in place for forecasting the future. Of course, models can offer explanatory power, predictive power. On the right-hand side, you'll actually see an example of a Major League Baseball algorithm. So if anyone's seen the movie Moneyball, you can know that numbers can offer substantial predictive power when you start to distill it down into a scientific approach. If you're looking at building a championship winning Major League Baseball team, almost every organization now is going to adopt some kind of advanced statistical analysis for determining, the best players to draft and trade for. Similarly, we can adopt models to start giving us a tremendous amount of explanatory power when we're trying to predict both enrollment and revenue streams based on those enrollments. So there's a lot of different models that could be chosen from, and we are going to be covering a few of them today. But keep in mind that the best models are the ones that can be compared against themselves. One approach may be very effective, but how do you know unless you actually have an ability to compare the model with what it predicted versus what actually happened at the school? Just like we can compare, the performance of a Major League Baseball team based on, the model or the approach they had in building that team roster. So let's start with enrollment, then we can talk about the revenue side of things later on. But when we look at enrollment forecasting models, there are a number of different approaches, and we do have very simple models. We also have very advanced models, but one isn't necessarily better than the other. We have, in fact, many institutions have found that going with a simpler approach has actually proven more effective at predicting the future than a more complicated approach. So certainly, I'm not suggesting that there is a best model. Otherwise, this would be a much shorter presentation. The reality is that you have options as an institution, and it's best to perhaps try multiple approaches to see which is going to best suit your particular organization. But there really is no one size fits all, and unfortunately, ChatGPT-4 can't answer this question for us either. I tried to ask it before this presentation. So let's look at our first model. This is the simplest of the approaches that we're going to be covering today, but really the baseline model is just going to look at all of your counts of students across your various programs at a given institution. And then it's going to look at the ratios of these different students between the different programs and the overall institutional enrollment. So let's use a quick example. I have a school, and 50% of all the students are enrolled in my English program, and 10% tend to be enrolled in math and science. Now, as an institution, if we are thinking about increasing our enrollment by 100 students next year, this baseline model would suggest that 50 of those extra 100 students will go into English and 10 will go into math and science. And really, I could build a simple spreadsheet probably in a matter of, an hour or so to project these values based on those ratios. And then as an institution, we can decide whether to shrink or grow our enrollment, and we can adjust the counts accordingly. Now, the pros to this is that, it could be done in a very small amount of time. The cons, of course, is that we are really only looking at overall institutional growth or reduction of student counts, and we aren't factoring in any of the multiple variables that could determine or fluctuate what those percentages look like. This model is not going to be able to account for my Nobel Prize winning English department leader leaving the institution, for example, which may have inflated the demand for my English program versus the other programs that are offered at the institution. But it can still give you that very quick and easy baseline to kind of start planning for the future. And it does factor in, a very important aspect, which is that overall institutional growth. Second model we can explore would be our trend line analysis. So, if you look at the stock market, this might look very similar, but we can look at using statistical or regression analysis to determine trends over multiple historical years. What are the trends within the different programs at my school? Once we can identify those trends, and once there is enough of a sample size to have a trend, then we can extrapolate those trends into the future. If that same English department is on the downtrend because my award-winning professor left, we will be able to forecast those trends to continue, so that maybe it's dropping by 10% each year. Next year, I'm going to have a 10% reduction based on that trend line analysis. And if I've had 50 students in my science program every single year since the inception of the school, it's natural to have a very flat trend in that case, and we can more or less always be comfortable in forecasting of 50 students in that program next year. So even though regression analysis can take some more advanced formulas, it is relatively simple to calculate. You could have a simple Excel spreadsheet to look at some sample size of historical data and then to identify those trends and extrapolate those into the future. So that's the pro, is that it's relatively easy to have this set up. The cons would be sample size issues. If you don't have good data going back long enough, then it's going to be difficult to associate relevant trends to the information. And the reason why I put wrenches here at the end is because there's any number of different impacts that could completely blow one of these trends up unexpectedly. So, the pandemic, for example, is a pretty big wrench that was thrown at virtually every higher education institution. This trend line analysis certainly would not have factored those things in, like going from in-person learning to remote for some amount of time. Now, naturally, wrenches are always going to be difficult for any model to predict unless we continue to improve this AI type of side of things. Okay, so the third example we can look at is what's called a Markov chain. This is actually a very big concept in information theory, and it does have a lot of real-world applications, including statistics, biology, and a number of other disciplines. Markov chains are excellent at actually predicting states or future states based on probabilities. So essentially, it's going to be a mathematical way that we can predict what a given state will look like. So in the case of enrollment, we're going to look at a specific program or a specific pool of students. We're going to predict what that future state will look like. And so we can see an example of a simple Markov chain. On the right-hand side, I say simple kind of in jest. It's a little bit complicated, but I'll try to give you an example, real world, to make this a little bit more intuitive. Let's say I'm running a restaurant, and my restaurant serves tacos, pizza, and hamburgers. So let's say tacos are A, burgers are B, and pizza is C. Now let's also say that on Tuesday, we're always going to serve tacos, naturally. So that A could be our starting point. However, I never serve the same menu item on Wednesday, so I'm never going to have tacos on Wednesday. So we can rule out A repeating. So that's why you don't see that arrow that repeats on itself. And you can also see that it's relatively rare to repeat the same menu item once you move past Tuesday. So from going from A to C or A to B, we're going to have different ratios or likelihoods of us serving either burgers or pizza on Wednesday after we've done our Taco Tuesday. So in this example, it's 40% of the time we're going to be serving burgers, and 60% of the time we're going to be serving pizza on Wednesday. And then once you're at that state, you can see the likelihood of going to the next, and so on and so forth. So if we were to serve pizza, we go from A to C. Does pizza repeat? Well, it does 20% of the time. 20% of the time, we're going to be serving pizza both on Wednesday and Thursday, and then from there, we can kind of continue on with this exercise. So we're coming up with a probability of moving from one state to another, and that's really where Markov chains shine, is the ability to predict these future states. However, there are some weaknesses to this approach as well. There are factors that can really screw up Markov chains, like those wrenches that were mentioned earlier, and you can see that this can also dampen the effect of outliers, which is great in a model, but sometimes those outliers are necessary to be highlighted as well. So there are pros and cons to all of these approaches. The other con to Markov chains is that they can be a lot more complex to actually implement in a real world scenario. So moving along, we have our cohort survival method. We see this featured a lot in K-12 school boards. And this will basically indicate how likely it is for a group of students to continue or survive from one semester to the next. So basically in this model, we're looking at a population of students, and we are then tracing the likelihood of them surviving from that initial semester to the next semester. So if I'm a freshman undergrad and I enroll in a given program, there is some likelihood that I drop out after that first semester. There's another set of likelihood that I drop out after semester 2. And if it's a 3 or a 4 year program, we would expect a large drop off of students to happen at the 3 and 4 year marks. Of course, some students may continue on further, some might drop out earlier. The idea is that we're basically coming up with these ratios and these attrition rates to figure out how likely is it that a student actually continues on given these circumstances. And those circumstances are usually based on historical data. And we can also come up with these persistency ratios that can account for external factors such as birth rates, demographics, students transferring in or out, and those types of things as well. And that's why it's so common in the K-12 space to use this type of approach, because demography is going to be one of, if not the most important factor in your given jurisdiction as a school. So we have a huge increase in the birth rate, we're going to start forecasting that huge increase in future student populations, or vice versa if it's a decrease. The fifth and final model we're going to be looking at on the enrollment side is going to be what we call the University of Delaware model. This was a white paper that was developed by the University of Delaware, who was searching for an effective way to forecast both enrollment and revenues. We have included this as a handout, so if you'd like to download the white paper, it's not overly long, and they've come up, in my opinion, with a very simple yet sophisticated way to predict both enrollment and revenues based on those enrollments. Essentially, the model will look at historical data, and it will allow you as an institution to come up with what are called yield rates versus retention rates. A yield rate is basically looking at number of applicants to your school and also the number of applications that you accept. So if I'm a student and I'm applying to your school, how likely is it that my acceptance is accepted based on the program that I'm applying for? And then if that acceptance is accepted, if you give that offer to that student, how likely is it that they will actually accept their acceptance? So it's looking at both sides, both from the application standpoint and from the likelihood that they actually attend the institution side as well. And then we can look at those retention rates to say, of those students that have, that we have yielded, how likely are they to survive as we move from one semester to the next, which is going to be a component of that cohort survival method. And the other nice thing is that this is both a 2-in-1 model. It's also looking not just at the enrollment side, but also the revenue side, which is why it's something that we would certainly recommend looking into. This is not an exhaustive list, but there are other methods out there. And of course, there's always going to be new methods and models created over time as well. What works best for your school is going to be determined based on, the efficacy of the various approaches. So, see what's out there, look at what's best for your institution. And I would recommend taking multiple approaches as well to see, what offers the best explanatory or predictive power. Now, the revenue side tends to be a little bit easier than the enrollment side. Once you have the number of students that we can expect, it's usually a trivial exercise to then figure out how much money we can expect based on those counts of students, because usually these things are fairly set in stone. And that first bullet really does distill down most of the revenue projection models. It's going to be, my count of students as well as my rates for what I charge those students. So really, we're just multiplying counts by rates, and then that's going to give you your revenue figure. But keep in mind that any model that you have does need to figure out into all of these different dimensions. So, in this program, there is an optional student fee, for example. Well, if the student has the option, then we need to factor that into our model. What if every student declines or accepts that option? We need to be able to kind of put those variabilities and those variances into the model if it's going to be useful for predicting how much revenue to expect. But ideally, whatever model is going to allow your decision makers and your stakeholders the ability to create multiple what if scenarios. What if we were to increase tuition? What if we were to decrease enrollment? And this is going to assist hopefully planning and decision making at the especially senior levels of leadership within an institution. So maybe we're thinking about creating a new program. And this program, we need to factor in multiple expenses, but we also need to factor in potential revenue streams that would come as a result. So if your model can allow for this type of analysis, then great. If you don't currently have a clean or easy way to do that, then that's maybe an opportunity to look at some of the options that are out there. Okay, and so when institutions do move from kind of theoretical methods to practice, to practical applications, then there's a number of different kind of considerations and approaches that you need to take into account. The first and by far the most important is going to be buy-in, especially from senior leadership, from various stakeholders. You need to have buy-in for any solution to ultimately be effective as an institution. So whether that buy-in means people will trust the predictions that are actually being provided, or whether or not, that's going to be essential in the success long-term of any solution that you ultimately go with. Many institutions will lean on Microsoft Excel, which of course is a fantastic tool for conducting these types of formulas, these higher level calculations. And we can create spreadsheets to do a lot of wonderful things. So that's why Excel is a normal starting point when people are kind of embarking on this journey. But Excel also has its limitations and its flaws. Human error, version control, all types of complexity and opaqueness of formulas can make Excel, also a challenge, which is why some institutions will consider building their own homebrew solution. Maybe you have a couple of computer science students that take a crack at making a more sophisticated solution to this kind of problem that maybe goes one step beyond Excel, or maybe it's a homebrew solution within Excel. Either way, this is one approach that an institution can have when they're trying to create a solution to a problem. In this case, predicting future enrollment and revenue streams. And then the final option would be to look at platforms that are out in the market. There are solutions that will allow you to do this type of thing. The advantage of platforms is that security, version control, some of those weaknesses to Excel can be shored up. But of course, the weakness to platform can be vendor specific. Not every solution is going to be created equal. And when we look at technology more specifically and how it can help you solve this problem of converting theory to practice, platforms can allow for much more seamless transition. Good vendors that are offering solutions that work are going to be a big value add, not just in terms of the software that they might provide, but also the kind of best practices that they have learned from similar projects, from working with similar types of projects and programs in the past. And this can also automate some of the calculations formulas that might otherwise be very difficult for different stakeholders to engage with. And most importantly, the ability to easily create scenario analysis. What if we were to change one of our variables, one of our assumptions, one of our drivers? If you're manually doing all of this in Excel, it can be very cumbersome to make those kind of changes on the fly or run those reports and conduct that analysis yourself. Future technology, I asked ChatGPT 4, didn't have the answer. Maybe ChatGPT 5 will. Certainly we don't know what the future holds, but one thing I can say is that as technology improves and becomes more sophisticated, then that does unlock the potential of some of these more sophisticated models, methods, and I'm sure future technology can only continue to iterate on this problem as well. So I wanted to show a quick proof of concept. Now, what I'm going to shift over to in this case is actually going to be a demo site that we have set up. And what I've done for this particular demo site is it is just looking at what we at Questiga call the intuition model. And basically intuition is borrowing from that University of Delaware as a concept, and then we allow our customers to iterate on that model because each institution is going to be fundamentally different in terms of how they categorize their students, and as well as how they want to calculate the revenues based on those students. But essentially what we do is centralize all of this data. We will import all of your statistical information that's relevant for these formulas and calculations to take place. So student counts, the different types of students and those classifications. You can see some examples here of the different head counts of students that we have as our proof of concept. So we're going to have, first-time freshmen, first-time transfers, so on and so forth. Each school will be different in terms of how they classify their students in terms of residency, in terms of amounts and fee categories. But all of this information is going to be unique to your particular institution. We may have different categories or classifications to students that you don't see here. We can easily build those into the model and then tell the model exactly how to calculate out these various calculations that need to take place. And what I've done is created a costing center as an example, but essentially you can have costing centers that will go through and do all of the calculations based on that University of Delaware model. What is my admit versus yield rate? What are my revenue projections for all these different types of students that we have at the school? This will all be centralized so that all you simply need to do is select all of your calculations and publish out those formulas so that the math will essentially be done for you. And what you're left with is going to be that comprehensive granular breakdown of all of your different students, as well as the budget or the revenues that can be expected based on those students. Now, I made this a dummy costing center, so it's going to apply to my entire fictional university in this case. And you can see for each of my different GL accounts, it's going to have a specific forecast depending on the semester that we're looking at. And in this case, we're only looking at the spring and fall semesters. However, some of our institutions will want a summer semester as well. We could easily add that into the model. And you can see the forecasted enrollment revenues and fees that we're collecting from all these different groups of students. And all of these are going to be based on formulas the same way you would in an Excel spreadsheet. The difference is we now have the security that you won't get in Excel, but we still retain that kind of formulaic and computing power that's behind it. And the other nice thing about having all of this centralized is that ability to, do what if types of scenarios. So, going back to our calculations, I may ask myself a question like, what if we were to change one of these enrollment counts? What if we were to change our tuition rates? Well, rather than changing the actual budget, what I can do is create a scenario. We're just calling it test in this case. And within our test scenario, I can change or override the tuition for any of these different areas. In fact, I just changed a single account. Let's scroll down. So what if we change our undergraduate resident tuition down to $1,349 a semester? Well, if that's the case, we're overriding what the usual tuition fee is. And now I can run a simple report to say, what's the difference? What would actually happen to our budget if we were to reduce that undergraduate tuition? This ability to create reports on the fly to compare two different scenarios side by side is one of the real strengths to having a platform like Questiga to be able to kind of show these numbers and display them accordingly. So looks like in this case, by making that one simple change, our tuition for both the spring and the fall are going to drop, and it looks like total, we're going to see a 2.5% reduction if I were to reduce the tuition by that amount. But of course, all of these drivers are now set up to be independently changed. And maybe it's not tuition that I'm changing. Maybe instead I want to change headcount. Maybe I want to override the amount of students. All of these different kind of variables can individually be adjusted in a scenario situation, so that I may want to, put in my headcount overrides, my tuition overrides. I can change or override any of the different assumptions that we're building in the model, and then run reports within a scenario to analyze what those differences or what those changes would actually cost the institution, or what those outcomes would look like. All right, so that was really the finale of the quick demo proof of concept. So let me just switch back to our question slide, and then any questions? Do we have anything in the chat? If not, I would certainly encourage all of you to download that handout. If you do have any other questions, please feel free to send me an email. You can see my email on the screen currently. And if not, then happy to give everyone a couple minutes back to their afternoon or morning, depending on where you're calling in from. All right, well, great. Everyone enjoy the rest of your day. I hope this was helpful, and yeah, please let me know if there are any follow-up questions that you think of down the road. And if you would like a copy of this presentation as well, happy to send that along. Just shoot me a quick email and I can attach the deck with notes and send that back to you. But really appreciate everyone's time, and hopefully we'll talk to you later.